Policy failure on climate change is going to put enormous pressure on both the military and the health communities, because in effect they'll be our first responders to the consequences of failing to address climate change. Anybody who thinks that a world that's 2 or 4 degrees hotter will be healthy or secure is kidding themselves. They haven't actually understood what climate change means.
Humans have changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, and in particular they've changed the quantity of heat-trapping gases by increasing them through burning fossil fuels.
We already know, and have done really for about 100 years, broadly, that carbon dioxide increases the greenhouse effect, and that's going to have knock-on impacts. So it's interesting how the estimates of the impact of climate change have not really changed massively over that period. It's just the models get more refined.
When you have the medical profession saying this is a major threat to global health, the security profession saying this is a clear and present danger, and many of my audience or my customers in business saying this is an unavoidable opportunity, it becomes a fascinating set of perspectives to explore.
Well, we in the military organisation operate across the whole of the world. We need to understand the environment in which we're going to be operating, and we need to understand the political, environmental and other stresses that might actually precipitate conflict in the future.
Increasingly, there's a recognition also that it potentially presents a challenge to global stability and our well-being. And by that I mean, it's not that climate change in itself is likely to start a conflict, but the impact of the second and third order consequences. When people lose their land, their livelihood, what do? Do they migrate? Do they migrate within a country, between countries? Is it organised, or is it chaos? Does it cause tension? Or if they have no livelihood, do they find something which is legal, or are they vulnerable to recruiting into organised crime or even terrorism?
So soldiers and the Ministry of Defence, those sorts of people who begin to talk more openly about the threat that climate change poses to security and the wars that are already happening around the world, the conflicts that will happen due to water shortage, fuel shortage, food, land shortages, displaced people, refugees, those sort of issues that are increasingly already with us and are going to become a much greater problem over the next 10, 15 years.
Why is it a problem for us here in Northern Europe, and perhaps the areas in the world where this is more likely to happen are further afield? Well, there's a band that runs around the world, centred on the equator, where there's already problems with health, food shortages, water shortages, demographic challenges, and we've seen conflict there in the past. Conflict is partly due to the result of the governments in those countries not necessarily having the capacity and resilience to deal with it. That in itself is a challenge, but that's where climate change is going to have its greatest effect. It's also where the world's trade routes run. We're a globalised society. We're all dependent on trade of some form or other, imports, exports, and in particular for us in Europe, energy, but also food and other goods coming from the Middle East and further afield. Same for China. 75% of their oil goes through the Malacca Straits. So we've got a global problem which is potentially going to affect global stability.
If you take an example like Darfur, where Merlin has been operating for some years now, that is huge health problems in Darfur, but it's caused also by climate change. That in turn is causing civil war. So the three are interrelated, and we're seeing that in large parts of the world. That's why it matters to us.
There are two main connections between climate change and health. The first is that climate and ecological systems are actually the underpinning of all human health. People think about the effects of climate change on commodity prices or agricultural yields and so on. That's fine if you're an economist or an agriculturalist, but what we also have to understand is that those are also the things that human societies and that human health actually runs on. So when we have climate change threatening to deplete water resources or threatening to harm agricultural yields, the real concern for us, the bottom line of that, is the impacts on human health, and particularly the most vulnerable populations in the world that are already struggling with climate-sensitive infectious diseases or food insecurity or water insecurity.
And so when you add those things up of disease, economic collapse, plague, pestilence, famine, starvation, you end up with mass migration. And if you get mass migration into resource-poor areas, you get conflicts and you get wars. And I come back to the fact that health has always been driven worldwide by poverty and war. And in the end, that's what's going to be the most rapid ramping up, I think, and impacts on health in the coming few years. But even if you sort of chose to believe that there was no such thing as climate change, if you go low carbon, it's massively beneficial for health and economies. So, for instance, if we say governments put in place a policy in the UK and in Europe, let's say, to make it red meat more expensive, so red meat consumption goes down, saturated fat consumption goes down, and we are able to and encouraged to exercise more by cycling or walking to work, okay, in less road. So air quality improves, we take more exercise, we eat less saturated fat. What you see then, as a direct result of that, is a huge low carbon benefit. Climate change ticks all the boxes. But we get less obesity, less diabetes, less stroke, less coronary disease and heart attacks, less peripheral vascular disease. You also get less depression, you get less Alzheimer's disease, and that's interesting. People haven't made the connection, but actually saturated fat and lack of exercise are big drivers of both depression and of Alzheimer's. So they fall.
If you think of reduced air pollution, for example, as we move away from coal-fired power, the health benefits of walking and cycling and sustainable transport, rather than everybody driving in their car, getting in their car to go everywhere. So we need to do all of those things, I think, as an overall policy response.
So it's not right to think that this is just costly. There are benefits as well, which can mitigate the extra costs which will come from moving to a low-carbon economy.
So as people change diet and exercise, you're not looking at a change in health outcomes in 20 years. Risks fall within weeks. And why would a politician want to visit breast cancer or bowel cancer on its public when it could avoid that? It's got to be a win for a politician, hasn't it?